Hey everybody, and welcome to the Foundation First Fitness Show with yours truly, Bob Owen. Today we are going to answer a quick question that I got on my YouTube channel that I thought was really interesting. I wanted to bring it up in today's show. And before we get into that, I wanted to give a quick shout out to a buddy of mine, Eric Nielsen, who just landed an assistant coaching job with the Bathurst Titans, who are in the Quebec Junior Major League, the former or won the Memorial Cup last year. And, you know, this is a guy who really impacted me a lot when I was with Montreal, in the Montreal Canadiens organization, when I was working with the Ice Caps in St. John's, Newfoundland. He was a player that came through the organization the first year that I was there. And, you know, it was the first year I was there. It was a very, you know, it was a very interesting time. You're learning a lot. There's a lot of speed bumps. There's a lot of learning curves. And he was definitely there for me a lot on many occasions to help me kind of figure things out and get a better idea of the entire, you know, the layout and how things work in the entire pro hockey kind of culture in the pro hockey world. So, big shout out to him. He's a great guy. They're a really lucky team to have him. He's going to have a huge impact on a lot of those youngsters out there. And I really wish him all the best and best of luck this upcoming season. Many of you have potentially noticed this little ball. For those of you watching on YouTube, some of you have seen some of my clips. This ball here sits on my desk. For the clients who have actually walked in here, usually always ask me what that is and what it's about. It's just a regular lacrosse ball sitting on my desk. This is actually the ball he used to use every single day in St. John's. Used to leave it on my desk, and when he left, he actually left it in my desk and wrote a little note for me. So I kept it and I have it on my desk, and so it reminds me of. It's a good reminder of all the time, of all the good laughs we had in those talks we had. So anyway. If ever you're listening, Neeler, congrats and good luck, man. Wish you all the best. So in today's episode, we are going to be answering an interesting question I had on my YouTube channel. Someone was watching one of my Move Better Monday clips and asked a quick question about hip shifting when they're squatting and why their hip was shifting, and brought up the question of whether tightness may have an impact. Now, tightness is actually a really interesting discussion simply because a lot of us attribute tightness or lack of flexibility and kind of use those two interchangeably. So I want to kind of touch on that first and then get into his question. And what I'm going to be discussing first will really lead into that. So it'll kind of make sense as I go through this. So the first thing is tightness is not exactly the same thing of lack and flexibility. They both have the same, they both present themselves the same way. They both show somewhat the same symptoms, but tightness is generally caused by an overworking muscle. So if someone's overworking, let's say their hip flexors, they'll feel very tight in the hip flexors. They'll think to always stretch it out. Now, stretching it out is a great idea. That's going to help kind of create some space in that capsule. So, for example, if the front of your hip, the front portion of your hip is really tight, and when you're seated, you feel like the front of your hips are always tight, that could be from constantly being in that shortened position and not being able to actually create movement and open that up. So that's not going to be a lack of flexibility. That's actually going to be a lack of range of motion and a consistently held position for over a long period of time. So it's an overactive muscle or a shortened muscle over a long period of time. Lack of flexibility is someone who just doesn't have the fiber range of motion. So the fibers can't stretch out that much, but it doesn't mean that they have a limited range of motion. They just have a lack of flexibility in a specific joint. So they'll have a complete range of motion not a complete range of motion, but they'll have a functional range of motion, and they'll maybe want to go get a little bit more. Potentially, if it's not entirely functional for their sport, they'll want to do that. Now, when it comes back to, tightness and lack of flexibility, the question was, would a potential tight hamstring cause the hip to shift? Now, the tight hamstring won't necessarily be the cause of the hip shifting, but a tight hamstring or a a tight hamstring would be the symptom that would present itself during a hip shift. So generally what will happen is if you have a tight hamstring, what could be happening is you may not, or that tight feeling in your hamstring, you may actually have a hip that's pitched forward. So basically what it means is that your hip is actually tilting forwards. And what that could mean is that you're generally seated for too long and you've got tightness in the front of your hip. Now, not to get into too much anatomy, I'm going to use my phone here. I probably should have brought out the skeleton, but I'll use my phone so I don't have to get up. But if your hip flexor in the front here, this is the front and this is the back. So those of you who are watching me on YouTube, you can see. So if the front of your hip is actually tilted down, so it's being pulled down, the back of your hip is riding up. What's actually interesting is that your hip flexor, I mentioned this, I think in an episode, earlier episode, but your hip flexor that's on the back, your hip flexor actually starts in the back, so starts on the spine in the back and then passes through and actually comes through to the front of the hip. So it's not actually just starting and ending on the front of the hip. It starts in the back and ends in the front. So it actually aids in that pull. So that's going to actually help the hip pull up. Now, what will happen there is that if you actually give up too much of that range to that hip shift forward, that tilting forward, if you give up too much of that to the front of the hip, your hamstring that's actually starting and ending on the back is never going to be able to pull down because it's never going to have enough leverage to be able to anchor and yank down. So it's going to give you that impression of a tight hamstring, but it's actually just not in a position to be able to stretch anymore and have you bring your leg up or bend your body forward because it's already pulled so far forward and it's been in that elongated position all the time, but it's trying its best to hold on. So it's actually in a very mechanically poor position to be able to function. So it's going to present itself as a tight hamstring, but that could just be, one side of your hip that's a little bit tighter than the other because you've been overusing that one side, or you have a dysfunction on that one side. So you have a tight hip, which is causing, so you basically have a shortened angle at the front of the hip, which is causing that tight hamstring, which is going to make you potentially shift your weight. So all in all, that's essentially what that entire thing comprises. So what I really wanted to discuss today was kind of spin off of that question a bit and kind of go into a bit of discussion along, tightness and stretching and flexibility. And I did speak about this at one point. I think it was in a post, but it was discussing flexibility, stretching. Should we ever stretch? Stretching is not a bad thing. It just depends if you're stretching for the right reasons. If you're stretching a muscle that doesn't need to be stretched, there's no point in doing it. But if you are stretching for a purpose, as I mentioned, to potentially maybe release the front of the hip. So spend some time foam rolling the front of the hip, then you're trying to stretch it out to create some movement, and then you're going to activate the back of the body, so the glutes and the hamstrings, to help kind of pull it down and engage that posterior chain is what we call it. Then that's a great thing to do because then you're going to be stretching what actually needs to be stretched, and you're not wasting your time stretching what doesn't need to be stretched. And I notice that a lot. I see that a lot in individuals. Tightness actually gets confused a lot. So we immediately think we got tightness, we've got to stretch it, but it's not always the case. It very much comes down to positioning, because if you're tight on one side, you could be tight on the other side because it's pulling it down. So your tension on one side may be just a lack of giving up that range. It's not allowing you to move. And the other one is it's actually been stretched out like crazy and doesn't need to be stretched out anymore. It actually needs to be shortened so it could come down into a comfortable position and kind of relieve some of that stress a little bit and actually allow you to be able to function a little bit better. So you really want to make sure that you're differentiating between the two. And again, it's very hard if you're not skilled in body awareness and you don't really understand the difference between the two. So don't be afraid to seek help for this and actually get a professional that might have an idea of why you might be feeling that tightness. Generally speaking, the majority of individuals will feel that in the front of the hip. And the reason they'll feel that in the front of the hip is, as I've mentioned in, probably 50% of my episodes, was the front of your hip gets tight because you're seated too long, whether it be at work or in your car or at home on weekends, or, a lot of athletes will get it when they're traveling, if they're going from work to the gym. If they have to travel a long distance from work to the gym, they'll get tight in the front of the hip and then jump right into a workout, and then they won't know why things aren't working properly. It's because the front of that hip is not giving up enough slack so that your body cannot start firing the right muscles. And I know I hit on the front of the hip a lot, and it's simply because if we look at the grand scheme of things, the population seems to be falling into that for the majority of cases. So a lot of us sit down. I'm sitting down right now. I sit down for a chunk of my day, even though I am in the fitness industry. Most of you would think I'd be standing. I do, but I do work a lot behind the desk when I'm creating these clips, when I'm creating these podcast episodes, when I'm doing all my clips on Instagram, when I'm doing all my editing and basically content creation. It does eventually get a little bit taxing on the front of the hip, which is why I use this desk that I'm actually sitting on right now is actually a sit to stand desk. So I can literally just prop right out of it. I'm trying not to prop too high, but if you're watching on YouTube, I just stood up and then I can just sit right back down. I've got a stool that really rises and drops pretty far. And it's also not a super comfortable, kind of reclining stool. There's no back to it. So I actually have to engage my core to stay up in this position. So it forces me to try to work that posture a little bit more and try to work my core a little bit more. And the only reason I do this is because I spend a lot of my time going from seated to standing, seated to standing, seated to standing. And when I am standing and I am working, I really have to be able to demonstrate a lot of these movements, and I can't be hindered by a tight hip or something like that. So I would probably tell you that, kind of tying into the question on YouTube and potentially answering some of the questions or probably answering some thoughts that you have. But if you are noticing that the front of your hip is tight, and if you are seated for a long period of time during the day, you're getting that back pain or whatever, the front of the hip is not a bad place to be stretching. I would actually advise maybe stretching it on a daily basis to be able to kind of relieve that stress that you're putting yourself in, because you're always in that position. And better yet, be a little bit more proactive and potentially stand up throughout your day. This is a performance thing. It's a foundation thing. You need to be able to constantly keep moving. Our bodies were designed to continuously change positions all the time and never stay in that one position for a very long period of time. If that's the case, you're generally going to be asking for a problem to arise, and that will be potentially in back pain, hip shift on your squats and stuff like that. Movement problems when you're at the gym trying to increase your performance. So you really want to make sure you're covering that as much as you can, because we spend most of our day in those unoptimal positions or compromising positions. So before I end off today's episode, I did want to mention that if you are listening to this on Monday, the 27th, thank you, calendar. If you are listening to this on Monday, the 27th, or Tuesday, the 28th, depending on when this thing is coming out on Monday, 27th, because I want to give any one of you who are listening right now a chance to keep an eye out. I will be doing a sit down potentially on the 30th with a couple of strength coaches that own a CrossFit gym in the Montreal area. We're going to sit down, do a quick kind of a roundtable discussion on some stuff, answer some questions. Hopefully we can get a nice Q&A session going there. Probably start off with about 5 to 10 minutes of general discussion, and then kind of give you an idea of what they do and give you a background of them, and then fire right into some Q&A. So I will be posting something on my Instagram account to ask some questions during that time. If you don't remember, if not, shoot me an email, shoot me a message. Post something on my Facebook wall, something like that. Just try to get a question out to me, and I will try to get that answered for you in that Q&A session with those guys. These are some guys that I really like. I like what they're doing. That's why I'm having them on the show. I think they're forward thinking a lot, and they've really come a long way with their business. We've known each other for about 5 to 6 years now, probably more than that, probably close to 7 years now. And so, I've actually seen I've seen their business kind of grow over the years. So it's going to be really nice to have them on the show and talk a bit about that and kind of give some input on a lot of the stuff they do. They're big time power lifters, big time Olympic lifters. So they're going to be able to answer a lot of those questions. If you have any questions on there, if you want to talk strength, if you want to talk squat, deadlift, power cleans, hang cleans, all the Olympic lifts, this is a good time to get those questions out. I'm sure they'll be trying to get some questions from some of their audiences. So if you are going to ask me a question, I'd really appreciate it. It'd be awesome to kind of get that in there. So again, thank you very much for listening. If you guys are listening on the podcast, have a great day. If you guys are watching this on YouTube, it's probably coming out a little bit later at night, but I hope you guys had a great day and hope you guys have a great day tomorrow. And until the next time, guys, keep building that foundation.